Okay, it's a pleasure to introduce Cheryl this afternoon. Cheryl is an associate professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Recreation Management at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, and she's the director of the Perceptual Motor Integration Lab. Her research program seeks to understand how information from different sensory modalities helps or hinders how humans perform movement. Her research is on a continuum from land-based experiments to applied community-based approaches, with a particular interest in understanding the role of sensory-motor integration and autism. Her research is supported by the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, MITACS, and the Canada Foundation of Innovation. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon, Cheryl, and I'll hand the floor over to you, and we'll ask some questions at the end. Thanks again.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for this invitation. I'm really excited to be able to talk with everybody today. I'm going to start my talk today by acknowledging that I'm today presenting from Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is Treaty 1 territory in Canada, and this which is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. So we respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in the spirit of both reconciliation and collaboration. So we'll outline just for our talk today is I'm going to start by introducing some of the key concepts and models to help guide our discussion of the sensory inputs. Then we'll talk about some examples from my lab looking at Vibrotactile stimuli as well as rhythmic auditory stimuli. And then I have a few examples of applying these different types of augmented sensory inputs. But of course, I'm very interested to hear your experiences and thoughts on these matters, as there's more opportunities to apply in examples than certainly I have experience with myself. Okay, so just starting off with the motor control models. This warm-up still works on Zoom. You can put your cameras on for this part if you would like, or you can do it at home, but I encourage you to follow along. So we'll start by doing a warm-up. You can be sitting or standing. We'll start by putting our right hand up, our left hand up, our left finger to our nose, our right hand to our ear, both hands to our shoulders. Okay, so now let's try this again with our eyes closed. I might cheat and peek just so I don't mix up the order. So we'll do right hand up, left hand up, right hand to our ear, left hand to our nose, both hands to our shoulders. So I want you to think for a moment, if you'd like to put it in the chat or turn on your mic, I'm certainly open to that, is what did you think about before you moved when I provided each instruction? And also, what did you think about while you were moving? And then some of the other questions we're interested in is, how did you know that you moved? So in all these cases, you had different forms of sensory input that allowed you to know where your limbs were in space, whether you could see them or not. But the other key thing here is that we think in terms of actions. We don't think in terms of which muscle we're going to contract in order to move our limb. Instead, we think about where the goal of our action is. And with experience and practice, we can learn to know what that movement should feel like. And so while this was a sort of fun and maybe a bit of a silly sequence, this is activities that we perform every day in both recreation, for example, in dance and music, but also in our everyday tasks with respect to things like making breakfast or performing our work. It also becomes important in, for example, emergencies. So being able to move our foot to the brake pedal when the car in front of us stops abruptly. So this is why many of the actions and experiments and tasks that we do in my lab involve reaching movements. Reaching movements are crucial for our everyday interactions and independence. And this is in part why children need older children or adults to help them with so many tasks like getting dressed or making a meal, because it takes time and a lot of practice for us to become proficient with these reaching movements. But an important part of that is when we are, for example, making breakfast or getting dressed, we're not, as I said, thinking about each individual muscle contraction or exactly where our limb is in space in each moment in time. And that's because much of what we're doing is controlled by non-conscious processing. And so when we're studying reaching movements, this can give us real-time insight into how that non-conscious processing from different sources of sensory information, for example, visual information or information from our somatosensory system, such as our limbs and our muscles. But it can also give us insights into what decisions we're making, so the cognitive decisions that we're making. And so there's a lot of information that can be extrapolated from what are seemingly on the surface very simple movements. So to that, there's a lot that we're still learning about reaching movements. And in part, it's difficult because of this non-conscious processing. We can't simply ask people, how is it that you do this task? Or what makes it easier? Because what we consciously perceive or think might make the task harder or easier does not necessarily translate, and actually often doesn't translate, to what is actually going on in that non-conscious processing. So just to look at this in a outline or schematic about how, for example, we go through the process of picking up. So I'm still in the morning, so we're still in coffee and tea time here. But I imagine, I think where most of you are, you're getting ready for other beverages in maybe cold mugs per se. And so when we're deciding which glass or mug or cup that we're going to pick up, we are able to look and we see the goal of our action, which is to pick up that cup. And so we think, as I said, with the goal of our action about picking up that cup. But then within our cortex, we go about planning that movement based on our previous experience with interacting with that particular mug or reaching and grasping other similar mugs. And once we have that movement plan, it's sent down through our spinal cord and eventually to our muscles in order to produce that action. Now, in addition to that, we're getting feedback while we're moving from, for example, our muscle spindles, which tell us about the length and the speed at which our muscles are moving. We also can see how our limb is moving in many cases. And that information is also sent back to our nervous system, where we can then, this green arrow is update those movement plans while we're moving. And so for any given reach, we're planning, we're integrating sensory input from multiple sources, we're updating our movements, all without thinking about these individual steps. And I always say, just imagine if you had to think about each individual step when, for example, you were tying your shoelace. And that's in part why tasks like this are so difficult when children are first learning to tie their shoelaces, because there are so many steps that require updates and accuracy. But with practice, we have a better sense and understanding of what that movement should feel like. And we're able to produce a more reliable and consistent movement plan that doesn't need as many of these loops and corrections. So in addition to the different sensory inputs, there are also a number of decision and updates that we need to make. And as I said, these are done without us consciously thinking about it. And in particular, as we become more skilled at a task, we move from somewhat conscious processing of the sensory information or the task goals to being able to perform that without consciously thinking about it. So this model is by Stephen Scott and is another way to conceptualize what is happening at a non-conscious level. And so what I wanted to draw our attention to is this idea or concept of an optimal feedback control policy. And what we can think about that control policy is as a way in which our nervous system, without us having to make conscious decisions about it, is able to decide and use the most reliable sensory information at any given moment in time or for a given task. And by using that optimal feedback from either the limb or the visual information, for example, we can know where our limb is in space, and then we can make these updates. And so just to finish that off, is one of the key pieces about human motor control is our ability to, with practice, use what can be called in some cases an efference copy, which I think about as a copy of the movement plan or a CC of the movement plan that is based on what we expect to happen. And humans can actually update our movements before we get that sensory feedback. And this is one of the reasons why predictive controlled or in robotics has been very difficult, because skilled human action involves multiple ways in which we can update and adjust our movements as we are in the process of executing them. So just to summarize, there are multiple overlapping processes involved in limb control. So there are pre-planned movements, and those plans get better with practice. We can compare both what we expect a movement to feel like with the actual sensory consequences, so that sensory information from our limbs, from our visual information. And we can regulate or update and perform very precise movements by integrating that visual information. So in order to develop and test these models, there are a variety of tools and experimental techniques that we use in our lab for performing our fundamental experiments. And I just wanted to highlight a couple that are relevant to the experiments I was going to discuss today. One of them is a 3D motion capture. So in this case, this is an OptiTrack system. And you can see here, it's mounted on the wall and it has 3 different cameras. And the reason it has 3 different cameras is that allows it to track the markers, which we can see some taped to the finger here, known as infrared emitting diodes. So these markers emit infrared, not unlike a remote control. And because we have the 3 cameras, the system is able to integrate the information from those 3 separate cameras and know where that iRed is in space in both X, Y, and Z. And this allows us to get a clear picture of how the limb moved through space throughout the duration of the reaching movement. Another key piece of technology that we use is various types of EMG. And so EMG tells us about both the onset and the consistency and amount of muscle activity. And we can connect that muscle activity to how the limb is actually moving in space. And so in our lab, we vary both the task, the participants, and the sensory information in order to understand how changing these different aspects influences how it is that we control movements. So in the next part, I'm going to provide a few examples of how we have varied the sensory input and how we vary the task and participants to gain insight into these different models. So we'll start by talking a little bit about vibrotactile stimuli. So vibrotactile stimuli, in this case, is a way for us to provide augmented or additional sensory input using vibration. And so this plays with stimulating or uses stimulation of the sensors related to our body. And so there are a variety of types of sensory input from our body that, for example, as I mentioned, muscle spindles give us information about the speed and the length of our muscles and the position. We also have sensory receptors that tell us about pressure and temperature. But relevant to learning skills and performing skilled actions is that these different receptors are represented in our cortex. And this little plasticine image, also known as a sensory homunculus, is a representation of what we would look like if we were proportioned according to the size of the limbs in our body. And what you'll notice in particular is how large our hands are. And so the amount of cortical space that is dedicated to a particular body part directly corresponds to how much accuracy or sensitivity we have with that particular body part. So that's why we prefer to use our hands. But notably is that with practice, the area in those pathways actually become larger and allow us to be able to perform those skills. And so we have, with practice, that proprioceptive feedback can be sent back to our brain to be able to compare to what we anticipate that feedback is. And with the addition of practice and those changes to our cortex, we're able to perceive more detail within our movements. So I'll start with an example where we varied both the task and the participants in order to help us understand the different ways in which we can plan and control movements. So this was a study that was led with one of my former master students, Ran Zhang. And we were interested in working with individuals with autism, or in some cases, the individuals prefer the term autistic. And so I will probably flip back and forth a little bit today, but I do want to acknowledge that identity first language is often preferred. So I will try to use the autistic terminology as much as I remember. So traditionally, and I would say more often, people were thinking about autism as having challenges with social skills, communication abilities, as well as in some cases attention. And when I say historically movement was not a major concern, what I really mean is that for many years, we were focused on the social skills and the communication abilities. But thanks to the work of people here like Spencer, as well as I think I saw a few others, we're really starting to understand that movement is an integral part of how it is we interact with the world. So social skills cannot be separated from movement. And in fact, our earliest interactions depend on movement. And so I'm very happy to say is that this idea of movement and its relationship with autism is becoming far more studied and accepted. But in this particular study, we were interested in connecting some of the literature related to how it is that autistic individuals perform these different types of goal-directed actions, such as pointing to different targets or picking up cups. And when we looked across the literature, what we found was that there was a disconnect in whether or not people found, or researchers found, that movement time was impacted by whether or not movement time was slower when autistic individuals moved to targets. And so a number of experiments that I had done during my PhD, as well as some other ones, we found that people with autism were slower when asked to reach to a visual target. But there were a number of other colleagues that had reported that, in fact, reaction time, or the time it takes to prepare a movement, was longer. However, moving was the same between neurotypical and autistic individuals. And so there was some evidence that there was a preference for proprioception, or that information coming from our somatosensory system, that information from our body, but that visual information might be more difficult to integrate when we're performing a movement. And so we wanted to understand what the effect of this additional tactile feedback would have on movement control. The idea being that if there was a preference for proprioception, that having that additional tactile feedback should help improve movement performance. But we also wanted to understand if there was a role for how complex the movement or the motor control was for the task. So I'll introduce the task a little bit. We had a start position, which was a small piece of the soft side of Velcro. And this was placed on top of a plexiglass type sheet. And underneath that was a fixation light and 2 possible targets. And so with each task or each trial, participants started with their finger on the home position. And they had 2 different targets because we wanted people to be moving and having to prepare and control their movement on different trials and not just repeat the same movement over and over again. but we changed the size of the target so that in such a way that each target with respect to how wide it was equally difficult based on the movement amplitude. So this was using a classic law known as Fitt's law. And so really it was just done to make the two movements of equal difficulty, but still require multiple movements. And so this same task or the same setup was used for all three tasks. But what we varied was whether or not they needed to control one dimension of the movement, 2 dimensions, or 3 dimensions. And so in order to do the one-dimensional movement, we actually had, thank you to the architecture lab at U of M, they used a laser and created a groove right across the board so that when participants were moving to the target, they could slide along that groove and they just had to control where they stopped. And so they just had to control that one dimension. For the 2-dimensional movements, we used a different surface that was completely smooth. And so the task was exactly the same, to slide their finger to the target, but now they had to control both the right and left axis as well as forward and back. And then finally, the 3-dimensional movements, it was the same setup, but participants were asked to lift their finger in order to move and touch the target. And so the participants started with the start position, the fixation light appeared, and then we recorded both EMG and OptiTrack so that we could look at both the muscle activity and how the limb moved. And after a random 4 period, one of the targets would light up, and participants' goal was to try to capture or touch that target as quickly as they could. And so you can just hear by an example of the task setup that we had both infrared emitting diodes as well as EMG electrodes in order to be able to capture the movement and how it was initiated as well as executed and the associated muscle activity. And so when looking at how easily participants were able to prepare their movements, this is looking at what is known as premotor reaction time. So premotor reaction time is the time from when the target first appears until we see a significant change in the muscle activity. But it's before the limb actually starts moving. And so premotor reaction time is thought to provide an indication of how long it takes our nervous system to organize the movement as well as to begin to implement the movement plan. And so here we can really see the impact of movement complexity in that when participants are performing that 3-dimensional movement where they need to move through space, even before they move, just organizing that movement requires significantly more time for our autistic participants than it does for our neurotypical participants. So they need more time to prepare the more complex movement, even though the task setup as well as the instructions were always kept the same. Now, when we look at movement time or how long it takes participants to actually execute the movement, what we can see is that when we get to the 3-dimensional movements, so now where participants move through space, we see that significant increase in movement time. And so while this was predicted, I've learned through my research training and career thus far is that I would say at least 50%, if not 80% of the time, my hypotheses don't come true or are not supported. And so this was really exciting to see because what we had seen in the literature was that when people performed these sliding movements, there was no difference between groups. But when we had asked participants to move through the air, we did see a difference. And so this was a within participant design that was able to directly compare these two types of movements head to head, and we saw that clear difference. Now, in addition to the longer movement time, we also saw that participants spent more time after peak velocity, so more time in the phase of movement where they're integrating that visual input or that visual feedback they've had in order to update and correct any errors in that initial movement plan. So again, this supports this idea of the tactile feedback when the task is changed such that tactile feedback is more useful. than the visual feedback, whereas the visual feedback is much more important when participants are moving through space because they don't have that additional tactile feedback. We see that the strategy in which our autistic participants are controlling the movements now becomes different than the neurotypicals. However, when we're talking about sliding movements, there is no difference because our explanation being that because you're able to use that tactile information for that optimal control. So from there, we were thinking about the fact if we add tactile feedback simply by changing the task, and this can benefit movement performance, is there a way that we can add sensory feedback to help improve performance of these three-dimensional tasks? And so again, our goal is to do this and achieve this in a way that encourages people to use their non-conscious processing. So what about augmented vibrotactile feedback at the limb? And so this systematic review was led by my PhD student, Niusha Mortaza, and she looked into the literature looking at using vibration for individuals who have had a stroke. The reason we focused on this is it's a very, very small literature and small population. And so this was one that we could find enough evidence to conduct a systematic review and meta-analysis. And what we found was that overall there was some support for using vibration to help improve proprioception and eventual motor control for individuals who have in a subacute or chronic stroke state. But was one thing that we noted in this systematic review is that the sensitivity of the different assessments and outcome measures. So that the studies that used more performance-based outcome measures that were based in time, so things like how much time, the movement time it takes someone to complete a task, seem to be more sensitive than other more qualitative assessments of how someone's performing the movement. And so certainly this was a small sample. There's not enough to draw strong conclusions, but it really encouraged us that we want to look at assessments that are based in time and accuracy in order to really capture change in a way that is more continuous, as opposed to looking for distinct categories of change that we can observe with our eyes, or I should say in addition to. So based on that, finding that there is some indication that there would be a benefit for adding vibration, Niusha set forward to developing a device that would allow us to use vibration in a more portable setting. So she's working on this vibration wristband that is able to provide very specific amplitudes and frequencies of vibration with the intent to support individuals who might be experiencing impaired proprioception. So there are a variety of reasons why somebody would experience impaired proprioception. Just like our vision and hearing change with age, as does our proprioception. And so there are also things like diabetes that may be impacted. And so we're developing this device and using our motion capture system in order to understand how adding vibration to learning different perceptual motor tasks might influence or support how it is that we perform our tasks with respect to being able to perform quickly as well as accurately. So just briefly, one of the studies she did once we developed and assessed the wristband to make sure that it was delivering the vibration that we intended it to do, is she had university students and other university people from the university community learn a video aiming task where they were not able to see their limb. So there was this board over top that impaired or blocked the vision of their limb. And they were learning a video aiming task where they were moving a target on a screen as quickly and accurately as they could. And the key information here was for us to first understand if people were able to acclimatize to experiencing the vibration. So when we do stimulate the tendons and the muscle spindles, what happens is you do get this feeling of movement. So there's an illusory movement that happens because we're stimulating the receptors in the same way that we would experience with natural movement. And so this first study was designed to figure out if people can become accustomed to that vibrotactile illusion and still be able to learn and become more proficient at a task. And so what we're just showing here is that variable error being how consistent someone was able to hit the target on one trial to the next. So how, in other words, a measure of how consistent or accurate they were, is that over a series of blocks of trials, they were able to become more consistent, whether they had experienced that tendon vibration or whether they had not. So this is one that we'll be continuing to pursue once the ability to resume testing and in-lab experiments is resumed a little bit more, because this one does require a lot of close contact in order for us to be able to further understand how the vibrotactile wristband may benefit performance. So just to summarize this, we use multiple sources of sensory input to move well. And the specific details are adaptable. So we saw that a simple change in whether or not we were sliding our finger versus lifting our finger can change the ways in which we integrate that sensory information. The other piece I wanted to highlight is that as we practice new actions, we become better at more than one thing. So we saw with the premotor reaction time that people become better at planning and preparing movements, but we also become better at predicting what a movement should feel like. And so with the vibrotactile illusions, we can become acclimatized to the different feelings, and we can learn to process that information and perform more accurately. Okay, so now I'd just like to highlight a few experiments that we've done recently looking at rhythmic auditory stimuli. And so our question here was, can rhythmic auditory stimuli facilitate performing skilled actions? And so this is something we experience in our everyday lives through things like music and dance. And so certainly we know that music and dance, the relationship between music and dance, really encourages us to move in different ways. But we wanted to understand in more detail how rhythmic auditory stimuli might facilitate these skilled actions. And so I wanted to start by highlighting some of the work by Michael Tho, who really pioneered using rhythmic auditory stimuli in a clinical sense in order to be able to help participants perform the movements. And so in his original experiments, participants heard a metronome type beat in the background while they were moving to different targets. And what we can see here is the overall pattern when people are moving with a rhythm. These are individual participant profiles, how smooth those trajectories are. So those are how the limb is moving through space. Whereas without the rhythm, we can see all of these peaks and valleys in the movement, which are starts and stops and corrections in the movement. So having that rhythmic auditory stimuli going in the background, simply, or just like having a drum beat in the background, helped to really smooth out and make the movements smoother and more efficient, but also made them more consistent. So it reduced the variability in the timing. And so one of the explanations for this is this idea of entrainment. So there are neural signals within our brain that when we hear that auditory stimuli, those neurons start firing at that same frequency. And so I like to think about this as the auditory system's version of when one person is swaying or bouncing a baby. And back when we used to be able to congregate in groups of people, you'd be bouncing or swaying with the baby, and everybody else would start moving in the same way. So we entrain and we start to time our movements to what we are both seeing as well as what we are hearing. And so we were really interested in this, really drives much of my research, was trying to understand how rhythmic auditory stimuli might improve movement kinematics. And so using our different motor control models, we wondered whether or not they facilitate movement planning, movement execution, or both. And so to start, I'll outline an experiment done by my former master student, Carrie Peters, who looked at whether or not the benefit of rhythmic auditory stimuli increase when other sources of sensory input are reduced. So in part, we were thinking, well, if the rhythmic auditory stimuli seem to be really helpful for individuals who have a stroke, one of the things that happens with a stroke is our sensory inputs are not as clear or robust. And so we wondered if we had neurotypical university students perform reaching movements, but took away their vision, would that benefit of the rhythmic auditory stimuli also increase? And so we can see a picture of the apparatus here. So this red button here was the home position. And we have two targets in space. Now, they're relatively large targets because, as you'll see in a moment, we also do this task with adults who have cerebral palsy. For participants, there's also a very small sticker in the center of the button, which is the goal of their target. So it is quite an accurate movement that they're looking to achieve within that larger button. And so here we can mostly see the computer, but up top is the OptiTrack, which is tracking how they're moving from each of the targets, so we can get those nice movement trajectories. And so the design for this experiment was a 2 sound before, yes, no, by 2 sound during. So what that looks like is sound before, they could have 3 beats before they got their visual go signal, or in other words, the target would light up and they would move towards the target. Or they would have the period leading up and then they would get their visual go signal, and at the same time, the rhythm would begin. And so the combination of these meant that if you had no and no, you heard no sound. And if it was yes and yes, then the sound began before and then continued after. And so participants performed movements to the different targets, and we recorded their movement trajectories. And so I'll just highlight a couple of the results. One is that sound before is the key ingredient to improving reaction time. So we can see highlighted here is that the reaction time is shorter when there's sound before, regardless of what is happening with respect to sound during. We also saw that sound before improved the spatial accuracy, in particular when vision was removed. And so therefore, it seems that the sound before was able to supplement or support that movement plan that resulted in more accurate movements. And so this actually makes sense when we connect back to some of our models of motor control, is that a key to performing a reaching movement when you know that vision is going to be taken away is to put extra effort into generating an excellent movement plan. And so if you also have that sound during that movement preparation, what we're seeing is that entrainment possibly that is occurring with that sound before is helping you develop that stable movement plan, such that when we don't have vision and we don't have sound before, we see large undershoots and large errors, whereas people are actually quite and remarkably accurate when vision was taken away and they heard that sound before. So as I mentioned, we've also done a task similar to this with adults with cerebral palsy. We modified the task in a few ways in order to help with performing the task. So we had a range of what are known here as the gross motor functional classification scale. I'm not sure how much it's used in the UK, but this is a classification scale based on functional mobility. And we had a range of individuals, many of whom use a wheelchair or other devices for their daily mobility. And so one of the adaptations we made is we allowed the targets to be moved closer if participants, so that it was a comfortable reach. And we also used iREDs in different parts in order to make sure that we could capture the movement trajectories. And so because we were varying movement because we varied how far the targets were, we really were interested in how did the sound influence their movements relative to when there was no sound. So what we have here is looking at how well they performed relative to their own baseline. And so we can see for the adults with cerebral palsy, there was a clear benefit for having the sound before they started moving. So having that preparation in order to entrain and prepare their movement. 155 milliseconds is a significant amount of time with respect to reaction time. That is actually equal to many people's reaction time. And so the improvement brought their reaction times much closer to our neurotypical adults. We can also see the large cost of having this sound occur as they start moving. And so that really slowed them down. So really, again, that sound before improves movement performance. We also saw some initial evidence, and this was a sample of 10 participants, I should say. And so it was a relatively small sample, but we did see some initial evidence that sound before may also promote online control. So this is looking at how much time they have in their movement available towards as they approach the target. And when they had sound before, they had relatively more time as they approached the target. So this is a more preliminary finding, but gives some indication that sound before may also promote effective online control strategies. So overall, with rhythmic auditory stimuli, participants reacted faster and had smaller endpoint errors when they heard sound before. And rhythmic cues during preparation seem to be enough to help facilitate performance for our participants. So now I'd like to share, and certainly this will, as I had mentioned earlier, be a small example, and I'm really excited to hear other people's experiences and with respect to different applications of using sensory cues and perceiving information. But just I'd share a few examples of how we can apply augmenting sensory inputs to help support that non-conscious control that we talked about at the beginning of our seminar. So there's lots of examples, and especially as technology is increasing with respect to providing apps and other types of technology and strategies in education, in sport, in our daily lives, in rehabilitation. And so there are many opportunities, but what I really want to highlight is we want to understand why and how each of these work. And I think when we understand why and how the different techniques work, this really helps us when we're working with individuals in order to be able to adapt our own instructional techniques to suit the goal that we're trying to achieve. So I just wanted to connect to some everyday examples. So we talked about rhythm improves movement planning, and a better plan can lead to better movements. And so one example is when we're teaching fundamental physical literacy or fundamental motor control with children, is we can use rhythm and sound to be able to help encourage the coordination that we're working on. So I have a picture here of, it's my oldest son in one of his younger dance classes. And one of the techniques that is used in dance is to pair sounds with the movements that they're working on. So a march is accompanied by a steady beat. And so the teacher will use what we call Mr. Timbre, and will produce that steady beat for the kids to march. For a gallop, they'll use an asymmetrical beat. And again, from what we're seeing from the basic science experiments, this is not only fun and engaging for kids, but does also help their nervous system be able to entrain to the timing of the beat and be able to perform these more difficult asymmetrical coordination patterns. And so the benefit here is it's both fun and motivating, but is also a way to connect and encourage that non-conscious processing, but in a way that really supports being able to control the movements. So there's just another picture and example. We can also use technology examples of that. So it's my son practicing Just Dance. And so with some of the dancing video games, we get both auditory feedback of how we're moving, but if they're holding the remote, they'll also get vibrotactile confirmation of how they're moving, which helps them confirm and know that they've performed the task well. There are other examples here, and you can't quite see, and I think unfortunately the video shifted on me. but I've saved it after. We can maybe take a look. This is looking at a run bike, and I know they're quite popular in the Netherlands and other places, and they've become more popular here. And one of the reasons I wanted to highlight this run bike is kids can learn to ride their bike so much faster at a younger age. And in part, the explanation for that is that the run bikes and the balance bikes encourages that non-conscious processing of that vestibular system, as well as those reactions for how to control and balance the bike without kids having to think about it. Just by having fun, they're able to develop that sense of where their body is and be able to predict and be able to, again, be successful at the task. So examples of how we can use our instructions, technology, and change our tools in order to promote our children or other learners using the sensory inputs that we want them to use, but in a way that they're not consciously thinking about it. So just two final examples are both product and program examples. So here is what's known as a squiggle wiggle vibrating pen. And so the idea behind it is to provide sort of sensory comfort as individuals are using the pen. But there's a lot of opportunity here in order to see how we might be able to use vibrotactile feedback to help individuals understand how their movements are being performed. And again, in a way that helps to promote that non-conscious processing. An example of a program example, and this is my PhD student, Jacqueline Ladwig, is working on this for her dissertation, is really trying to understand what are the key ingredients that help different adaptive classes, whether in this case, it's an example of explorability at the Royal Winnipeg Ballet School, which is an adapted dance class for adults with a variety of disabilities. But there are many other examples of dance, martial arts, and other sports. What are the instructional techniques that help people use and adapt to their own nervous system and to help people use the sensory information that is going to be most beneficial to their performance? So we'll just finish with a model that I think is helpful to frame our thinking when we're working with individuals. And this is an ecological perspective and also can be known as the constraints model. And it's not constraints as things that constrain or make movement bad, but think about constraints as a riverbank, in that the riverbank can shapes where that water travels. And so we want to shape that movement and help individuals to be successful. And so the model looks at the task, and in particular, our job as instructors is to think about how we can vary the task in order to promote individuals using the sensory input that is going to be most beneficial to them to be able to perform the task. And so we want to consider who our individual is, the environment in which they're performing, but as I said, in particular, what can we do with respect to our instructions, our tools, in order to help them learn to perform consistent movements where they're not consciously thinking about it. So considering why we might use different sensory inputs, how we might use them and when, can really help us to individualize our instructions. So just a few things to remember. A big part is that we're not just teaching motor skills, we're teaching perceptual motor skills. So we think in terms of actions, but what we remember is how a movement feels and even how a movement looks. And so we really want to pay attention to both the perception and the motor parts of our skills. We use multiple sources of information to move well, and we need to work towards practicing and becoming better at planning, preparing, predicting, as well as processing sensory information. So it's much more than being able to generate the specific muscle activity with respect to understanding how a movement looks and feels. So I just want to thank both my funding sources as well as all of my students and collaborators, without whom this research would definitely not be possible. And I'd be happy to take any questions now.
Thanks, Cheryl. Perhaps you could unshare your screen, and that way we can see everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. I'll start off by asking some questions from the chat first, and then obviously if anybody would like to ask a question in a typical way, please raise your hand. Okay, so this is from Bev. So from your experience then, why do some children do the movements but out of sequence?
Is there a specific example of which type of movement, or like thinking about like movement sequences with respect to dance and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it looks like it's a generic question, but I'm guessing, you know, so yeah, so perhaps just picking, you know, dance in terms of the coordination of sequences might be interesting to think about.
Yeah, so certainly I think, again, it goes back to the idea that when we're learning motor skills, we're learning more than one thing. So if it's a sequence of skills, what they might be particularly struggling with is more that memory for the order of the skills. So they have been working perhaps on the skills individually, but not necessarily how they all fit together. And so if we want to make our practice specific for that, then we would, you know, really focus on doing things. If the order is important, focus on that order, and maybe finding other ways to emphasize. That might be a time where it's helpful for them to draw a picture for themselves about the order. Oh, okay, I see close inside out, dropping pencils. Close inside out, that's one of my kids' still favorite things. So with respect to close inside out, I think they just don't care. That's something that we have put value on. To them, if it's comfortable, they don't mind. I also have a theory, and if I don't know of any specific research in this area, but if someone here does, is that kids love to put their shoes on backwards. And my experience is that preschoolers will tell you it's more comfortable. And I think that's because their natural tendency is to still have their toes out. And so to them, putting on their shoes backwards gives them the sensory cue of what their movement that they want it to feel like, because it angles their toes out. I've in many ways given up. I've found that they sort of just grow out of putting their shoes on backwards because eventually it feels uncomfortable. But I think it's tied to that feeling of what the movement is supposed to feel like. And so backwards feels like the movement's supposed to feel like, because they're still walking with their toes out. With respect to dropping the pen, I think that again goes to developing the skills around that tactile sensitivity. And so with all of our sensory systems, they slowly come online during childhood and as we develop, and then we become better able to integrate them. And then as we continue to age and develop, then the systems then also start to deteriorate on the other end. So kids are still developing their visual and in particular their tactile and perception. And so they don't have that same acuity yet. And so they don't get the warning signal in time. Yeah.
And I guess also with the sequencing, Cheryl, as well, some work that we've done in our lab here, and also the guys in Italy have done, is that autistic children seem to plan the separate segments. They don't connect the segments, you know, so that might be one of those cases.
We're seeing them as individual pieces as opposed to one.
Yeah,
sequence.
exactly. This is a question from Judith, who's a DCD researcher. Interesting question, actually. Given the co-occurrence between ASD and DCD dyspraxia, do you know if the movement in your tasks were ASD specific, or could they be co-occurring with DCD?
Yeah, and so from our sample, we're not able to separate that. I would say I've had multiple samples of adults with autism, and in part my PhD advisor really encouraged me to work with adults for my PhD, because at the time he pointed out that there was still a question about whether there was just a delay in the motor system coming online, or whether there was a continued challenge with integrating that sensory input for that motor control. And so there, I would say, is a lot of back and forth. I haven't looked at the DCD and ACD or ASD or autism literature specifically lately to see what is there, but I know there's a number of people questioning whether or not we should even be organizing by DCD and ASD, and whether we should be looking more at look more at the behaviors and less at the specific diagnosis. So you can not have a diagnosis and you can have trouble performing certain skills and tasks as well. And so with respect to the DCD and ASD, I can't say for certain in these samples because we didn't have a separate control for that. Interestingly enough, when I first moved to Manitoba, DCD was not a diagnosis that was used. I know. And so I had a PT contact me and say, she was a school PT, and we met up and talked, and she said, I've got these kids. And she describes like, well, that's developmental coordination disorder. That's what it sounds like. But it wasn't a diagnosis that was being used. So I hadn't gone down that route a lot of late, but our former dean, Jane Watkinson, has done a lot of work with DCD as well, and looking at the impacts in adults. But again, not necessarily that comparison, because I think I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, and even how we separate those diagnoses. Is it a fair, because I don't think I agree with the idea that you can't have a diagnosis of ASD and DCD.
Yeah, no, I don't. I just hear it a lot. You know, we know that children with ASD often have movement difficulties, and I just wondered what your views are, whether they are separate or whether they're the same. You know, what we should do. But your work's really interesting, and looking at rhythm for individuals with DCD. I'm really interested to talk about that, because that would be something that was really useful for adults with DCD, because their disorder is very visible. And if it would be something, it's something that I've had in the back of my mind to help just with walking. You know, just to get that walking in a more typical way would be great. So anyway, really interesting talk.
Thank you.
Okay. So Lisa Porter made a comment, Cheryl, in the chat. I know that you trained as a PT yourself. She said that yes, just by having fun. I'm an OT. We use body-based play, enhanced proprioception, vestibular tactile to increase feedback. It's all about fun. That's that kind of applied slant to your work as well, which was quite cool.
Yeah.
I'll ask a question, please. I'm particularly interested in the motor planning aspect of autism, and we've showed differences in motor planning. Could you comment, I don't want to put you on the spot here, what you think these pre-reaction time differences are? What's going on in that? What's leading to those pre-motor reaction time differences in autism?
Yeah, and that was one of the things we struggled with that particular design, was separating out the differences in tactile feedback, but then the difference in having to control your limb in space. And so because the premotor reaction times were specific to and became more pronounced as people needed to control their limb through space, I think it has to do with organizing what that plan has to be in it. And this goes back to some of the work, Vibro work and some of the work from my PhD, where we see that initial variability in the movement. And I think it comes down to this idea of you're making a plan and you're hoping the plan is what you think it's going to be, but there's a lot of noise and variability in what that plan is. And I think this could be tied to fundamental differences in neuroplasticity. And this goes back to the idea of, what's perhaps similar and different with DCD. And I think if we think about neuroplasticity as how easily we can carve out those pathways that we need to follow. And an analogy I often give my students is, and it works very well in Winnipeg, is snow. And so when there's fresh snow, you can't see the pathways, and it's more difficult to move, and there's a lot more variability in where you go. But the more people that travel the path, so the more that neural pathway is used, the easier it becomes to stay on that pathway. And so I think for individuals with autism, as they're learning something, it takes them longer to get that pathway. And so we get a lot of variability in generating that plan, but then also in implementing the plan. But they're able to use feedback. It just takes more time and update those. But I also think it fits with the idea of the skills that are well learned are done really consistently. So once they get that pathway, they can repeat and use the pathway quite reliably. It just takes longer in some cases to get to that stable neural pathway.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I'm mindful that it's 4 minutes past 5. You can probably see the chat yourself there. You know, I think the overarching sort of feedback is that it was a wonderful talk, very stimulating. So thank you very much for your time over in Manitoba, and the wonders of Zoom allow us to do this, and it's been really great to hear your talk this afternoon, Cheryl, and no doubt we'll collaborate moving forward. So again, thanks for the SEND crew for watching this afternoon. I'm going to stop recording now and we can have a little chat afterwards, Cheryl. So thanks again.
Yes, thank you everybody for coming.